For those of you who were at IG19, you may remember Tim, he gave us a really interesting talk around identity and access management. It's something that I think is a growing challenge for all of us, and hopefully this is round 2 and a few more insights. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Oh, hello everyone, good to be back again. So my name's Tim Perkis from the University of London. I'm a senior IAM specialist, and I'm going to be talking about supporting cloud transition with IAM. You might remember from last time, so this is Senate House, it's the home of the University of London. University of London is federal. It's a loose federation, so most of the member institutions look after their own students and their own identities and their own data centers, their own infrastructure, etc., etc. We at the Central University do look after the 55,000 or so distance learning students. That's one of my roles, is to make sure they've all got user accounts, etc. Two interesting things about this photograph. The shade of blue there is a nice azure, or azure, maybe. And interesting, there are no clouds in the sky. You can draw your own conclusions from that, I think. So a little bit about identity and access management for those of you who aren't specialists in it. So to me, identity and access management, like Soylent Green, is about people. It's about making IT services understand the people within the organization. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that actually means in practice. So the three kind of big areas I consider are identifying who our people are within the organization, names, contact details, etc. Giving them identifiers so that systems can actually identify them. Allowing systems to actually identify who they are. Technologies around how we actually prove who people are, so around credentials management, around verification of people. And finally, what people can do when they're actually interacting with our services. So some of the typical identity processes that we'll be coming across, you'll probably be familiar with a lot of these. So from the identity side, generating unique identifiers so that we can, like I say, determine who people are, provisioning and deprovisioning user accounts so that our users can actually access services, managing credentials, passwords, so that we can actually allow users to prove who they are to systems, and generally all that kind of stuff around people data. So when people log into a system, they can see a nice welcoming bit of text that says "Hello Tim," etc. Not necessarily "Hello Tim" if you're not called Tim when you're logging in, that would obviously be confusing. Processes around access management, so determining the association that person has with the organization, maybe putting those people into groups, maybe issues around licensing, making sure people can access the right thing and are licensed to access the right things. Authentication services and privileged access management, so people that need elevated permissions to do things with systems can do so securely. And therefore secure our data. And the final aspect around management, auditing users, reporting against user activity, compliance, attestation to make sure that people still have the access they need, and if they don't, that it's removed. Typical benefits of identity and access management, doing it well within the organization. Improvements to the user experience, so the users are logging in a clear and consistent way. They're not having to remember lots of different sets of credentials to log into lots of different services. And we make that kind of as familiar an exercise as possible. There are benefits around automation, so removing error-prone rekeying of personal information, driving processes from data in source systems and making that reliable, and also then pushing that ownership of that data back to departments within the university, so we don't have to worry about making sure that data is accurate from an IT point of view. Making processes more efficient, removing administration costs and support costs around provisioning user accounts and credentials management. That's obviously one of the big kind of areas that bothers our service desks, password resets, etc. And integration, benefits around integration so that we can actually join systems together and those systems can understand the same view of people from across different systems. So let's look at some of the cloud transition scenarios and how IAM kind of starts to fit into some of those. This is a film called A Matter of Life and Death. To some people, cloud transition is going to be a matter of life and death. There's an alternative title, though, to this film, that some of you may know, which is Stairway to Heaven. So perhaps that's a better description of our journey. So the basic premise that we're working from is the on-premises premise. So this is the old-fashioned kind of view that all our people were within our organization, all our data about our people was within our organization, in our data centers. All the services that we were offering were pretty much in our data centers. All the client kind of side computing was done through student computer rooms, computer clusters, etc. And from an identity point of view, our identity services were all on premises as well. So we'd have the data about our people centrally, we'd have synchronization services or scripting or whatever that we were using to provision accounts, and we'd have our authentication directories, maybe our LDAP directories, etc. All on premises, all running on our data centers. And we've always had the problem of shadow IT, the problem of people doing their own things. Obviously, the advent of cloud services, SaaS solutions, etc., means that users can now sign up to services that we've got absolutely no control over. We can't even go and shut off that machine that's sitting under somebody's desk. We may not even know about what's going on and what users are signing up to. Then we've got the extension of services and the adoption of services entirely outside our data centers and our control and our infrastructure. So the adoption of SaaS offerings. This is where, obviously, as you know, entire services are offered by external service providers. But those services still need to know about the people in our organization so that we can interact with them. Otherwise, we do end up rekeying or transferring large amounts of information across. And although obviously those can range from a small service that a few people have signed up for through to a large-scale service, maybe the adoption of a dynamic CRM solution in the organization, or possibly an entire platform, an entire ecosystem like Office 365, which has multiple aspects and complex licensing, etc., etc. And then on the other side, on the client side, we've got clients, users bringing their own devices in, and we need to make sure that we're extending our identity services so that our users can log into multiple devices that we don't necessarily have control over, but they can still access our services safely. And also that we're able to synchronize our identity data off to software as a solution type services. Infrastructure as a service, and obviously you're all experts in this kind of stuff. So the gradual extension of services from our on-premise data centers into public cloud architectures. And that might just be extending various facets of that, like the disaster recovery or backup, or it could be that we're actually migrating, lifting and shifting service to run in those public cloud environments. The same issues from an identity point of view exist. We still need to make sure that people can access those services regardless of where they sit. And then we've also got the ability to re-engineer services to take advantage of more of a platform of a service approach where you can adopt different components. So we might have front-end components, compute components, data components. And we might again be using cloud offerings in order to extend some of those capacities, maybe at start of session or clearing, and we need extra capacity, and we can maybe start making use of platform as a service components to do that. Or we might have services that we actually want to move one particular part of the architecture to a cloud offering, maybe extend the database or host the database remotely, but keep the compute on premises where we've already got existing facilities. So what do some of these mean for identity and access management and the data about people that we got within the organization? The University of London, we're looking to do some fairly large-scale shifting to the cloud and transitioning to the cloud. I'm involved in the cloud transition program at the university in order to try and keep an eye on it from the identity point of view. We're looking at adopting more SaaS solutions to replace some of our on-premise solutions, and we're looking to lift and shift stuff out into the public cloud to free up some of our data center space, which can then be reused by estates for other things. So from a software as a service point of view, where we've got services in the cloud and we've got our people within the organization, and the people are always going to be within our organization, then this kind of services that we need to offer from an IAM point of view are around authentication, credentials management, multi-factor authentication increasingly, making sure those cloud services are aware of how we want to carve things up in terms of permissions and what users can do, and also actually integrating and passing that data around between our data about our people that's on the within our organization out to those cloud services. So here's Professor Orlock again, returning to his office. Now, when it comes to shadow IT and the challenges around bringing your own device, again, we need to make sure that the identity services are able to cope with this, so that users are perhaps less inclined to go off and sign up to an external service, and perhaps more inclined to come to the IT department and see how they can actually integrate that. So we don't end up with services being run from somewhere within the organization, and we've got no concept of controlling who's got access to the data that's been put into those services and who the users are. And we want to avoid having a department saying, oh, we'll look after this ourselves. Well, actually what we want them to do is to start authenticating against a central service so that we can, when we know when people leave, we can actually close down their access in a controlled way, as an example. And where we've got hybrid infrastructures increasingly, then the same thing applies. So we've got services that are partially running on premises, partially in the cloud, varying degrees between them. But again, we need to make sure that if we need to access those cloud services, that we're doing so with the same credentials, the same user information is available, and the same kind of identity processes and practices are available regardless. And I think that's particularly important for issues like disaster recovery. It's no good having your disaster recovery instances in the cloud when your authentication is still hosted on-premise and you've lost your on-premise servers. So privileged access management. I'm not sure which ones are the sysadmins here. Perhaps the ones with the big suitcases full of their root privileges. The privileged access management has always been a difficult kind of concept. It's really as much around process as it is going to be around technology, but there are some technologies that will underpin privileged access. And basically, for those of you who haven't really come across the concept before, it's about actually managing those privileged accounts in a controlled way. So just-in-time access, just enough access in order to do those things with elevated that require elevated permissions. And of course, that's not necessarily just us as sysadmins or as IT professionals. It's potentially those users out in the business who have access to run the payroll or access to modify financial data. And those are the kind of people that we need to ideally think about when it comes to privileged access management. And of course, privileged access management becomes more complicated when we've got a disparate environment that includes cloud services, because we need to not only look for what it means for system administrators of that remote service, but we also need to think about what it means for our users with elevated permissions within the organization. Again, not necessarily tied to an identity that we can manage within the organization. So, some solutions. Now this is Cary Grant carrying a rather suspicious-looking solution up the stairs to his wife in the film Suspicion. So I don't know whether the solutions I'm about to offer are poisoned or not. First one is the concept of the identity store. Now for me this is something that I think I mentioned last year, but it's the idea that you have a consolidated view of the people within your organisation that you can use for all those kind of purposes. Passing data out to other systems, use it as the sort of core aspect of your integrations when it comes to actually passing data around people, about people around between systems. And the identity store is separate from your authentication source. It's something that we can use to drive provisioning. It's the data that we can use to drive provisioning. And of course in the HE sector, we've got multiple sources of data about people, not just one. We don't just have an HR system containing staff, we've got an HR system, we've got a student system, we've probably got an alumni database, we've got applicants coming in and maybe not getting an identity until a certain stage. So the identity store helps to bring that data together in one place and becomes then an asset for the organisation when it comes to actually making that data available to other systems. To me, ideally, it's platform independent. It's not tied to a particular piece of technology. It's just a database. And hopefully, the way I've been designing the identity store at the University of London, it's a fairly simple database, not too much complexity in there. But it's got some of the business rules in there around formatting of email addresses, formatting of user IDs, etc., that can be hopefully easily maintained just as bits of sort of SQL procedures, no heavyweight code in there, it's just something that hopefully is easily maintainable but also transferable, not tied to a particular platform or system. Authentication. So one of the key things for me, again from an identity point of view, is to try and make authentication as easy as possible for the end user. Comes back to that user experience thing again. So I'm trying to bring us back down to a single source for authentication. You can see the little Azure AD logo in the top corner, which might give you a clue about where I'm trying to go with this. Obviously, as with most organizations, we're provisioning to an on-premise Active Directory. And that on-premise Active Directory is synchronizing off to Azure AD. And what I want to do, hopefully, is to move more and more of our services to authenticate directly against Azure AD, that external directory, so that we can remove the dependency on having 7 domain controllers on premises or wherever they can obviously be hosted in the cloud as well. But we can remove that dependency on Active Directory, drive everything from Azure AD, provision directly to Azure AD, and actually have a single source, which would allow our users to have a single interface for actually authenticating. And that's obviously not a solution that's going to suit every organisation. We've got particular setup that allows us to actually think in that way. B2B and B2C. Now, Microsoft are quite canny in naming their product offerings after the business processes that they support. So B2B becomes tied to Azure B2B and Azure B2C. But really, the concept is behind B2B for the HE sector is around collaboration. So it's about allowing us to actually collaborate, but actually from an identity point of view, it allows us to manage an identity and control what that identity can do within our organisation, but pass off the credentials management and the actual authentication back to the home institution. And that's actually quite good. It means that we don't have to manage lots of passwords for people, but we can still control what that user can do from within our organisation. And although I mentioned Azure B2B, there are of course other offerings that do the same thing. And essentially this is how we get away from some of the other kind of federation technologies that might perhaps be holding us back. And Azure B2C is really about customer identity and access management, might alternatively call it that. And this is really about those opportunities that we might have within the organisation to allow users to bring their own identity, bring a social identity to do some of their interactions with the organisation. Won't be appropriate in a lot of cases, but certainly I can think of some. Applicants, for example, being able to log in to do their applicant process without us having to manage credentials for them. Possibly alumni at the other end of the scale, once we can deprovision their account but leave them with some means of actually still accessing our services. But also we might have a research website or a research activity that results in a website that requires some kind of public interaction. And we can allow the public to come in and interact with services and manage their own credentials or use their own credentials rather than us having to manage things. And that can be a benefit if you've got an application team, a web application team, supporting a research project, and they can actually build something that integrates with a central service rather than building an application that manages user credentials and maybe they don't actually manage it that well because they're not used to actually building that kind of aspect in. So lastly, just a couple of moments on how we actually plan around this. And one of the tools that I've been trying to use is the idea of the roadmap. Now this is a still from a film called I Know Where I'm Going. And we can see this actually, I think, quite appropriate. Wendy Hillier here looking quite pensive about what's to come. Robert Livesey looking like he's in control, looking through that compass. But there's about a huge wave about to crash down on them from behind. So hopefully that's the kind of thing we want to avoid. We do want to know where we're going. Now to me this is all about planning where we're going to, how we're going to get from the state we're in at the moment to a future state. So from my point of view, for example, if I want to move towards having Azure AD as our central authentication source, what does that actually mean for the services involved? Which services can cope with that, which can't? When we start looking to replace services with a SaaS solution, how do we actually approach that? We're going to need to try and make sure those SaaS solutions can actually use OpenID Connect so that we can actually use Azure AD in order to allow our users to access them. So the roadmap really has two aspects to it. It's got how we actually deal with the IAM services themselves and how we can actually move IAM services. So in the context of our cloud transition, where are our IAM services going to be on that cloud transition? Are we going to actually keep our IAM services on-premise for as long as possible while we've still got dependencies on AD? Or are we actually going to try and move them at an earlier stage and get rid of those dependencies on AD? And how can we fit all those blocks in and overlay our IAM roadmap onto our cloud transition roadmap? So that is pretty much it. I was just going to say that some of the benefits I spoke about IAM earlier on apply again. So hopefully you can see how some of those solutions help us to align what we need to do with IAM with what we need to do when we're actually thinking about adopting new cloud-based services or transitioning out of our data centers to new services, new infrastructure services. And that really is the end. I think it's lunchtime now, isn't it? So there'll be no questions. Unless you've got questions, of course.
Thank you, Tim. As he's pointed out, we are up against the lunch break, and Tim's done a marvellous job of getting us back on track, actually, because we're running a little bit behind.
Yes, I hurried through that.
Time this morning. Has anybody got any questions before you all go and get some lunch? I don't think so. Little point behind, if you could help me thank Tim for that insight into